Hi everybody, Noah here with Learn Meta-Analysis. In this video, we're going to talk about study screening and inter-rater reliability, two really important but misunderstood concepts in the meta-analysis and systematic review process. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to create inclusion and exclusion criteria for your study. You'll be able to identify the inclusion and exclusion criteria and how they are used to screen studies, and we'll be able to track excluded studies so your work aligns with the PRISMA reporting standards. So one of the other things that we're also going to discuss briefly, and I do mean briefly, is various types of inter-rater agreement or reliability that might be appropriate for your use case, because there are a couple different approaches that could be relevant to what you're doing. Okay, so first we need to deal with this idea of inclusion or exclusion criteria. So these, along with the actual search string, are really fundamental to the entire systematic review process, okay? They are going to actually define the scope of what your review analyzes. So it's really important that these are not only clearly defined, but also that they're well planned so that you're actually capturing the studies you want to capture and excluding the studies that you want to exclude. And I know this sounds like very, very, very common sense, but as you start to put together your inclusion criteria and start screening full text studies, you're going to start to see that like these things are really more time consuming than you think they are when you first start with this process. One of the things that people ask me a lot is, should you constrain your studies to certain types? The first thing that comes up a lot is journal articles. So should I only include journal articles because of quote unquote quality? So personally, I completely disagree with this approach. I think in the vast majority of cases, this approach is outdated. The reason I think this is because I have read a lot of absolutely terrible journal articles. I mean, things that I honestly do not understand how they got through peer reviewers and an editorial team. So saying something is quality because it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, to me, doesn't hold any weight. I don't buy into that argument. Second, my perspective on systematic review is that we are trying to understand the nature of the field, everything that's out there, right? We are trying to capture everything that's published. We're trying to capture things that might not yet be published. And because of this, I also try and include articles from conferences, articles from book chapters, and I mean, the other thing is a lot of times when we conduct these studies, we'll actually send messages out on listservs asking if people have anything that hasn't been published but might be relevant to our analysis. So the other piece to this, and we're going to talk about this in a later video, is this idea of publication bias, of only studies with significant results tend to get published, or the majority of studies with significant results tend to get published, and things that tend to have non-significant studies or non-significant results, or perhaps results contrary to what may have been expected, often don't get published. They instead end up in somebody's file drawer. You'll often hear people talk about the file drawer problem in meta-analysis. So for all of those reasons, in the vast majority of cases, do not recommend only restricting your articles to journal articles. I pretty firmly believe that we should look at other sources of data as well. Now, the second one is a little bit more complicated. I had somebody ask me recently, I speak English and I pretty much only speak English. And so they asked me, how come when you do your systematic reviews, your meta-analysis, etc., you always have that the study must be published in English as an inclusion criteria? And to me, the reason is very simple. I don't speak any other language. I can't read any other language. And so I would have a very difficult time interpreting these other studies. Now, with modern translation tools, it is becoming possible to actually read studies in other languages and search for studies in other languages, but I personally do not feel confident enough in those tools with scientific literature yet to do that, and this is 2024 when I'm recording this video, so it is very possible my perspective on this might change, but for now, my perspective has been, if we have people on our team who speak different languages, then by all means, search in those different languages. But often cases for me, I've been working a lot of times with people who only speak one language, like me, only speak English. And so I don't feel confident that I can not only search those databases in other languages appropriately, but also interpret and extract the information appropriately, not speaking that language. So I include this as an inclusion criteria so that it is explicitly clear that there might be a lot of other studies out there that are not published in English. So this is something that I think is going to be dynamic over the next few years. I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing that these translation tools are going to become very, very, very robust as we're seeing these big advances in AI. And so it may become more of a streamlined and simple process to actually analyze studies in different languages as time goes on. But for now, I think it's okay to say that you're only considering studies that are published in your native language. All right, so I want to give you guys an example here. I think that this will help put these kinds of things in perspective. So the study that I'm talking about here could be the impact of pedagogical agents on learning, and it's going to be a meta-analysis. And so again, when we talk about pedagogical agent, that's just a virtual character that helps somebody learn. So let's take a look at what this might look like. So for inclusion criteria, we must include a group that worked with a pedagogical agent and one without an agent. And that's because we want to have our main comparison, right? Our first research question in this is going to be something to the effect of what is the impact of pedagogical agents on learning? The unsaid information in that question is we need something to compare it to, right? So because of this, we need to have one group that worked with an agent and one group that worked without an agent. Next, because this is a meta-analysis, the study has to report enough statistical data to be able to actually compute an effect size. Third, the study must be focused on learning with or from an agent. And I know this seems kind of obvious, but from working in this field, I know that there are studies out there that are not necessarily focused on learning. That's not really necessarily what the intention of the study is, but they measure learning in some form or something that could be interpreted as learning. So we might want to have a inclusion criteria like this, that it must be focused on learning with or from an agent. As I was just speaking about in regards to language, I only speak one language, I only read one language, so the studies must be published in English. And it also must be publicly available. So I put this in there because we can typically request things through interlibrary loan, and we can send emails to the authors to ask to request a paper that we couldn't actually locate the full text through a database. But sometimes the reality is we check in our database, we can't find it. We request it through interlibrary loan, and for one reason or another, we can't get it. Maybe we send an email to the author, but we can't find a current email address for the author, so we keep all of our emails that we send get returned to us. This is a reality of doing this type of review, and so that's why I have this inclusion criteria of it must be publicly available, because sometimes we just can't get the full text. So now let's talk about exclusion criteria. In this case, none are actually needed because all of our inclusion criteria can actually work as our exclusion criteria by simply looking at the inverse. So if it didn't report enough statistical data, it's going to be excluded. If it wasn't publicly available, it's going to be excluded. But this isn't always the case. You may end up setting up your inclusion criteria in a way that you have a study that meets your inclusion criteria, but isn't of interest for what you're actually looking to measure or evaluate. And in those cases, you may find you need additional exclusion criteria. Okay, so now let's talk for a few minutes about study screening. This is typically a two-phase process in the process that I use. I break this into two phases called phase 1 and phase 2 because I'm really creative like that. So in phase 1, this is our title and abstract screening, and this is exactly what it sounds like. We review titles and abstracts. Phase 2 is the full text screening, and this is also exactly what it sounds like. We review the full text of those studies that made it past the title and abstract screening phase. An important thing here is that we need to record everything, right? Remember, we are trying to create really replicable and transparent reviews. So how do we do this? First, we want to record the number of studies that were excluded in phase 1, and we want to make sure that we have this. We'll need this for a Prisma flowchart. Number 2, we want to record the number of studies that were excluded in phase 2. But here's the difference. We want to also include why they were excluded. And we want to do this for each and every study. So at the end, when we're creating our Prisma flowchart, we can actually include in there, we had this number of studies rejected for this reason, this number of studies rejected for this reason. All of this is part of really important, transparent record keeping. Okay, so another very common question that I get asked, how many screeners are needed throughout this process? Like, can I just do a systematic review myself, or do I actually need a second person? Well, I'm going to tell you what the norms are that I've seen in educational sciences in 2024. So as of now, for phase 1 title and abstract screening, it's pretty normal to only have one author review all of that. Phase 2 screening, where you're looking at the full text, again, as of now, it's pretty common to only have one author review all of that. Data extraction is different. in this phase, we have to have at least 2 people, and 2 people is often better than more, simply for reasons of trying to get consistency among coders. But we'll talk more about that here in a minute. So, yeah, basically all I wanted to say with this last point here was that we can include additional screeners, right? This is going to reduce our workload. So let's say, for example, that we have 100 studies that we need to extract data from. We could have 5 different people extract the data, but this is going to add complexity because that opens up a lot more opportunity to have inconsistencies in how the data is extracted. All right, so on that note, we're talking about inter-rater reliability here. It's not just about consistency, okay? Because I had somebody ask me one time, like, actually I've had this asked multiple times, but they asked me, why can't I just extract my data and then like 3 weeks later come back and extract it again for the same thing and then compare how consistent I was? Well, I don't like that approach, but let me tell you a little bit about why. So first, I just want to mention that you generally need to have some sort of inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement for any stage of screening with more than one screener or coder. So that means if you had 2 people screen abstracts and titles, you need to do some inter-rater reliability or agreement testing there. If you have 2 people review the full text, same thing, okay? So anytime there's more than one person involved, you need to do this inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement calculation. Next, data extraction in terms of standards in the field essentially requires inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement to be reported. It is by far the standard in the field right now to have at least 20% of the sample for data extraction also independently coded by a second person so that you can calculate this inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement. Now, one thing I want to note is that inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement is not just about consistency between the 2 coders. Okay, so I mean, yes, that is what it is about. That is literally what we are measuring. But it really comes down to the definitions that you have for the variables that you are extracting, right? Because if you are, say, trying to classify studies, like let's say you're doing that impacts of virtual characters on learning study that I used as an example earlier. And one of the variables that you're looking at is classifying the outcome test as either a retention test or a transfer test. Now, the way one person may interpret that might be different than the way the other person interprets that. So yes, you might not have consistency there, but the whole point of this is that you're able to look at why you do not have consistency and how you can rectify that. Because the whole point, again, of a systematic review and having these transparent methods and replicable methods is the replicability. So we want to make sure that our coding form is actually written in a way that somebody else completely not associated with the project could reasonably extract the data from the same studies and come up with similar results. Okay, so when we think about inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement, we don't only want to think about the number. The number is important, but we also want to think about the root of the number, particularly if it comes out poorly. We need to go back to our coding form and look at, is this simply an issue of training, or is it an issue of defining our terms, or what's the issue that's going on here? Okay, so when we talk about inter-rater reliability, inter-rater agreement, what is it exactly that we're talking about? Well, there's a lot of different types that I've seen reported in the literature. One of them is simple agreement. So how much did the 2 raters agree? How much should the 2 reviewers agree? This is a great question. Personal opinion, I prefer to see in my own studies an agreement of over 90%. That's not necessarily like a end-all be-all benchmark, but this is what I like to see. And as I said, I tend to calculate this and then go back and look at the root cause of the disagreements. And oftentimes what I find is that there's just 1 or 2 variables that had, I'll just say like sloppy definitions where it was easy to classify them as different things. We go back, we modify our template, we clarify our definitions, and then we can typically improve our agreement even more at that point. Other types of inter-rater reliability proper are Cohen's kappa or Fleiss's kappa. The number that we typically want to see is over 0.80. You can go back to some of the primary sources as to what these different values mean, but typically, in my experience, reviewers have asked us to have this over 0.8. And again, I haven't found this particularly challenging to actually have happen. It's really about how clear your coding form is and how well you've trained the other people coding the data and how consistently they're able to actually code it. So again, you need to report this in your manuscript and you need to conduct this. So oftentimes what we will do is when we are setting up our coding form, we'll just code 1 or 2 studies. We'll see what our agreement looks like. If it's looking pretty good, we'll continue. If it's looking pretty bad, we'll go back and we'll make some edits before we're even at 20% in many cases. So there's lots of strategies that you can do to help you have good consistency without having to like recode huge amounts of studies over and over and over again. And really it's about planning, making sure that you're going through your variables ahead of time. Maybe use 1 or 2 studies as a training set to see where some of those issues come up before you start your official inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement calculation. So again, we'll talk more about that in a future video. Okay, so the other note that I wanted to make is that particularly with calculating kappa, there's a lot of statistical programs that can help you with this, things like SPSS, things like JASP. So if you're worried about the statistical side, I wouldn't be. There's lots of software that can help you do this in a very easy point-and-click fashion. Okay, so the only other type of statistic that I've seen out there would be correlation coefficients. I don't see these super often, but I see them relatively frequently. If I had to totally guess, I'd say maybe roughly 20% of systematic reviews or meta-analyses that I read report some form of correlation coefficient. I would say the most popular form of reliability or agreement that I see is kappa. After that would be agreement statistics. After that would be correlation coefficients. So that pretty much concludes our video here about study screening and reliability. I hope you find this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Thank you.